Thank you so much. And thank you, Enrico, for the invitation. As usual, it's really a pleasure for me to talk and discuss with your research group. And I'm really happy to talk after Antoni's beautiful presentation, because in a certain sense, my remarks will be sort of a continuation of Antoni's presentation, even if my considerations on Nishitani's full and complex work will be very less precise and articulated than Antoni's one. But I will focus more on a specific theme, which is the theme of reflection or speculation in a dialectical and a Hegelian sense, which, in my opinion, as I read those pages, emerge explicitly and also implicitly in the text, which is the object of this seminar session. In this sense, I think that the concept of reflection appears in the text declined in multiple forms. For instance, the relationship between subject and object, relationship between the self and the other, the immediate and the mediated, the negation and the negation of negation. And so my contribution will just attempt to reread Nishitani's considerations in the light of this very concept, in the light of the concept of reflection or mirroring. And so my goal at the end is to define, also from some passages in Religion and Nothingness, so to define the crucial role of this metaphor of reflection, of mirroring, in indicating, we can say, the original union of the self and God. But before going further with a more specific analysis of Nishitani's text, I just want to make some introductive notes, because I think that mirror and mirroring, more generally, it's a crucial tool of philosophy and theology, because it assumes also many and peculiar meanings in the history of philosophy, in the history of theology, also starting from ancient and Greek mythology, because for instance, if we take the example of the mirror of Dionysus, we know that contemplating himself in a mirror, Dionysus sees the world as reflected. And so this means that Dionysus is all things. It is the universe itself. And so this mirroring just reflects the inner nature of Dionysus itself. But after contemplating himself in the mirror, he's also molded by the Titans. And so this sparagmos, this death of Dionysus, means that Dionysus himself, who is the world, who is the universe, is concretely made manifold as the world is. And so in this sense, reflection works in this sense. But the mirror, also in Greek mythology, can also be something deadly and mortiferous. We know that Narcissus, while watching himself reflected in the surface of a lake, just fall in love with his image, and finally he died. He died drowned in the water. And so mirror in this sense has also a deathful role. Mirror provide a kind of deadly double. But if we go just more deeply in philosophy, philosophical tradition, if we take, for instance, Plato's Cora, we know that in the Timaeus, Plato suggests implicitly that Cora works as the liver And the liver has, Plato says, this plain and polished surface, which is used for divination. And this plain and polished surface is like a mirror, which is full of traces, because it reflects as images the forms, the Eide, which come from the nous. And so also Plato's Cora, as the liver, works as a mirror. Also in theology, we have many examples. God or the soul are defined in many cases as mirrors. For instance, Cusanus describes God as the mirror of all the mirrors. So God is kind of a universal and absolute mirror that reflects in itself all the particular mirrors, which are the specific and particular souls. Also in Hegel, of course, we have a powerful philosophy of speculation. Speculum in Latin means the mirror, speculare, to mirror, to reflect. Also in Heidegger, if we want, we have this powerful idea of the mirror play of the fourfold, the Gevierte. And so this notion, as we can say, just crosses the history of philosophy and theology by assuming different meanings, different roles. And of course, this list could go further. But I think it's interesting to notice that the very history of Homo sapiens is by its very origin defined by this peculiar movement of redoublement, of mirroring. If we take, for example, Paleolithic and Neolithic cave paintings, we can see how reality, in a certain sense, has to be redoubled, has to be represented, to be accessible, to be something that can be dominated, that can be comprehended. And so reality is something that needs a symbolic repetition to be possessed. And also Homo defines himself, comprehends his position in the world by this mirror movement, by this symbolic and doubling reflexive process. And so in the sheer act, we can say in the sheer act of tracing a sign on the stone or in another surface, a difference is produced, a polarity, a duality. And I think, and I'm sorry for this very long and extensive introduction, but I think that this is really important to say to understand the beginning of Nishitani's considerations in this text. And I just want to quote briefly some sentences from page 196, when Nishitani says, and I quote, "Although the human being is a natural entity, birthed by nature like any stone, grass, or beast, it becomes intoxicated by the ferment brewed by interhuman relations, by society, and forgets that it was churned up from the earth." And slightly ahead, "Since the time early humans painted their faces in clay and saw themselves mirrored in reflecting waters, the human being lost an immediate feeling of itself and obtained the now deep-rooted habit of grasping itself within the reflective eyes of the others. The mirror is the universal eye of the other." So I think that this sentence is really interesting. And I think that in this sense, we can say with Nishitani that the human self is, in a certain sense, defined by its relation with a form of alterity. And in this sense, the ego is split, is divided. It needs to reflect itself in the other, in the eye of the other, the universal eye of the other, Nishitani says, and it needs to reflect himself in order to be. And so it needs to experience negation. And of course, this movement is a dialectical movement, even in the Hegelian sense, kind of subject-object relation. And in this sense, the self is defined as an ego. I think this is a really important passage, because Nishitani says the ego is just an eidos, so it's a form which is, in this sense, as I read and understood the text, it's defined by reflection. The society, Nishitani states, is divorced from nature, and nature means the absence of reflection, the absence of the double, an immediate identification with the worldly forms. And I think that this is really interesting if read in parallel with Nishitani's considerations on Nietzsche in this text, because for Nietzsche, modern society has lost this immediacy. And so to the all too human world, this all too human world is the world of reflection, is defined by reflection, is defined by this kind of redoublement, which is culture, which is society. And this is a kind of, as I comprehend it, a bad reflection. Because it identifies an egoic self, a self which is locked in the dual relation with the negativity, with this eye of the other, which works as a mirror. So also Antonis rightly spoke of alienation. Now, alienation, which means to be in relation with something which is aliud, with something which is other. And in this sense, alienation implies a form of reflection, a form of reflexivity. In this sense, I'm also trying to distinguish between this reflection, this kind of reflection, which is in a certain sense a bad reflection, because it determines the self as an ego, as an eidos, which for Nishitani obstructs the self as a place of passage of the great life. And so this bad reflection as alienation, is an extrinsic reflection. So reflection which occurs between two exterior forms. Of course, this reminds to Hegel, Science of Logic. And it was really surprising for me to notice how Nishitani makes explicitly and implicitly use of Hegelian dialectics here. And so in a certain sense, in this kind of extrinsic reflection, we have a finite which becomes indefinite, so an indefinite play of reflection between a subject and an object, and so a polar play of a dyad, of a duality. And for Nishitani, Zarathustra teaches the death of God and the death of the self as eide, as forms defined by their extrinsic reflection. And so this, Nishitani underlines, this requires a transformation of the ego. And so the free Nietzsche's metamorphosis from camel to lion, from lion to child, I have to negate the negation. And the only way to abolish negation, and thus to abolish this kind of extrinsic reflection, is to square it, so to make it exponential. Negation of negation, reflection of reflection. And this exponentiation is a power. So the power of the will is precisely this square of the negation, this negation of negation, which becomes an affirmation. So the child, of course, represents this kind of immediate experience, but I have to metamorphose myself to reach this state, to realize it. And so this immediate experience is the very result of mediation. By this process, Nishitani states, negativity as mediation and unmediation are mediated and become unmediated. So one cannot just go back to a pre-reflexive state, to kind of pre-human state, because Homo sapiens, as we have seen, produces himself through difference, through reflection. So I cannot just go back to a pre-reflexive state. There is no escape from reflection. What is necessary is a metamorphosis. So the necessity to square the reflection, to make it absolute in a certain sense. And this is why I want to make this distinction between this kind of bad and extrinsic reflection and another kind of reflection, kind of absolute reflection, this exponential negation and reflection, as we have seen. Because for Nishitani, the eidos, the form, which, as we have seen, is defined by its speculative relation with something exterior to it, obstructs the flow, the very flow of the great life. And so once the eidos of the self is destroyed, the self can dance, we can see with Nietzsche. But what does it mean to dance? To dance means to receive all forms, letting them flow. So the self is void of a form, is void of a specific eidos. It is not fixed in an extrinsic reflection with something other. For instance, God as an object, as Nishitani states, because the self is void. The self, which in this sense is a sort of non-self, welcomes all the forms, all the aid. It is like a void mirror. It is like Cora. And so this is what I try to name exponential reflection, absolute reflection. So the self itself is the mirror of every form because it is void of form. And so as we have seen so far, the extrinsic reflection leads to an absolute reflection. So the self as an eidos, defined by the objects which reflects it, becomes void, becomes a non-self, and it becomes itself the manifold. It is the pure and absolute mirror which reflects every form. And so I think that this leads straight to Nishitani's reading of Eckart as well. Because for Eckart, also in Religion and Nothingness, we can find some very suggestive reflection on this point. The self and God reach in Eckart a place in which both stands in their true nature, a place that is the innermost of both, that is at the bottom of both, and that is the most intimate place, maybe as also St. Augustine would suggest. So in this place, the soul contains God, and the God contains the soul in a sort of double envelope. And this is because this place is at the ground of both, as it is the same ground. And so Nishitani also quotes a very insightful sentence by Eckart, while he says that the eye by which I see God is the same eye by which God sees me. So my eye and God's eye are one eye, are one same glance. And so reflecting each in the other, they become a oneness, a kind of pure reflection which reflects itself in itself. And this also reminded me a peculiar definition of Basho by Nishida, when Nishida says that the ultimate place is that of a consciousness which is conscious of itself, like a mirror which reflects itself in itself. And this is again sort of absolute reflection. So not the reflection between two forms or eide, but a mirror in which everything is reflected without being present outside it. And so this is the pure void, a void mirror in which each thing stands in its tatata, as Nishitani suggests using this Buddhist and Sanskrit concept. No? Tatata means suchness. And so I think that this is how the concept of reflection works in Nishitani, in this Nishitani's text. And to conclude, I think that we can use a sentence by Hegel when he says that the mystic is the speculative, the mystic is the absolute reflection. This means that what we call the mystic, with Eckart also, is precisely this capacity, this reflexive capacity for the soul, for the self, to reflect everything in itself, to become a pure and void mirror, to metamorphose from an extrinsic kind of reflection, which means alienation, to an absolute reflection. And so this was kind of my attempt of reading, and I thank you very much for your attention, and I hope there is some material for discussion, and thank you so much.
And a lot of okay, go in this order. So from circular process. Last. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, Tobias.
Yes, thank you very much for this presentation, which surprisingly echoed our discussion this morning and my own presentation, humble presentation, which focused on a similar theme.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I lost your presentation, but it was night in Italy. So.
Yes, no worries. But,
hardcore.
But it was very helpful to get back to the same topic, I think, from a different angle. So it added a lot of material, I think, for our discussion. But based on what we had discussed this morning, I would like to ask you how you see the differentiation that Nishitani introduces between the saint and the saint's relation to God and Zarathustra. Because it seems that in this text on Nietzsche and Eckhart, Nishitani is, together with Nietzsche, not content with this kind of saintly reflection of God as what you also depicted, introduced as God as this hyper mirror, as the mirror of all mirrors, as in a certain sense the universal eye of the other, which I think you can very much easily map onto this conception of God in the West. And you quoted several authors. I think you mentioned Cusanus and others who like to play with this metaphor of the mirror, the hyper mirror, mirror of mirrors. But it seems very much that judging from the text of Nishitani's, it seems that this maps much onto the position of the saint, and how the saint empties his soul, empties himself of every determinate eidos to become one with precisely the mirror as such, and then be open for everything in a kind of reflexive negation of all eide, his humanity, but also all created things, because he can identify himself with this absolute reference point, this absolute universal I of the other, with which he becomes one. But it seems that Nishitani with Nietzsche together, he emphasizes that one has to go one step further. One has to go one step beyond this point. And in a certain sense, this is kind of the metaphor that we used this morning, break the mirror or immerse oneself in the water surface, if one prefers this narcissistic image that also came up yesterday in the debate. But in any case, not stay content within this double reflection of mirror towards mirror. And maybe for your reference too, this morning I pointed out a text I've recently read by Nishitani, a late conversation he had with the Japanese theologian Yagi Seiichi, where he explicitly references this metaphor of the mirror in a Buddhist context. And he describes the encounter between two Zen masters as the facing between two mirrors. But then he says, this is not enough. Just the reflection of the mirror in itself, the mirror that mirrors the mirror, and becomes, in a certain sense, his own image, is exposed as the image of the mirror. And therefore, as this kind of, as you said, exponential reflection of the reflection, a reflection that only reflects reflection, is not enough, but it has to be transgressed towards something that Nishitani calls a mirror that is without any image, a dark mirror, a mirror that does not even reflect mirror as such, but that is in that sense infinite, because it is not just empty of image, but full of itself, but infinite because it is void and dark. And therefore, I wonder, so how do you see this transgression? And then more specifically, how do you see this, what Nishitani introduces in this text specifically, when he speaks of becoming open towards infinite eide, this moment of infinity. You mentioned this in the end with Chance. I think you could almost make a case that this is also something very Aristotelian already, when he says in a certain sense that the intellect as a faculty of the soul makes the soul be everything. In a certain sense, the soul is the totality of all forms that it can reflect in its intellect, that it can receive, because it has this total power of reception. But I wonder if what Nishitani here introduces as this infinity isn't something that remains at odds with this kind of totalizing reflection. So I wonder if not this absolute negation that Nishitani is driving towards is something that transgresses also this vision of a totality that is accessible from one special, exemplary or exceptional point of reference, like the universal I of the other, that functions as this kind of hyper mirror of all mirrors. So how do you see these relations? I would be very curious to hear your opinion on that.
Wow. So, really, thank you so much, because your questions and reflections really are really inspiring, and also help me to go further, and also to explicitate something that it was maybe implicit in my whole presentation, and that I had not the time to present and to discuss as well. For instance, your really right and appropriate, as I understand it, referment to Aristotle, the anima, the soul is all things, but also the 12th book of metaphysics, the nous, that thinks only itself, in a certain sense, reflecting itself in its but without, and this is precisely the point, without redoubling itself, without having, having itself as its object, but by having it only itself as the object of his infinite activity of thinking. This means that the object is no more an object, in my opinion. And so, going back to your first maybe your first question and reflection, I think that the problem that Nishitani has with the saint, the figure of the saint, and that he shares, as you said, with Nietzsche, is that in the peculiar relation that the saint established with God, there is still a residual of duality. And this is also why, as I understood the text, and also in Nietzsche's Zarathustra, the saints do not understand how and why Zarathustra go back to the world, wants to make a gift to people, because the saint is, is closed in a sort of schizophrenic relationship with God, by which in this mirroring, in this reflection between his soul and God, there is still a residual of duality, by which finally the world itself is excluded. And so I think this is the problem. And I think that in this sense, as you said, the saint doesn't break the mirror. It still remains in this mirroring kind of in what I call an exterior reflection, in a reflection that still has an object that still preserve a form of duality, even if it is a reflection between the saint's soul and God, even if the saints open his soul to the plenty of God's eidos. This is not enough, and what misses, in my opinion, is the world itself, because as you said, the soul has to become so much void as to welcome all the worldly forms. And if the saints cannot understand why Zarathustra go back to the world, why he goes back to people, this means that he does not understand the necessity to become one with all the forms. I don't know if I'm explaining myself, but I think that's the problem is that the saint establishes an exclusive relationship between his soul and God. That's why there is still a residual of duality, and I think, of course, mirroring and reflection is not enough if it preserves kind of duality. But I think that's when my soul becomes a pure mirror that reflects and welcome all the forms, all the Eide. This means that the mirror is broken in a certain sense, and it is broken because it is elevated to its maximum power. So I think that when this mirroring process reflects itself and has no exteriority, this means that the mirror is broken in a certain sense, because there is no more something exterior to reflect. So everything is as you said, is a pure and void mirror. So it's not a reply, it's not an answer, but it's just I was reflecting by myself your consideration, which I find really interesting and appropriate. I think there is much work to do on this topic, topic and much to say, maybe too much, but thank you so much. And I will think about this kind of things.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Next question is from Sova.
Yes. Yeah, I think this distinction between two kinds of reflection was really helpful to organize some of the discussion that we've had so far over the past couple of days. And in this distinction, I thought it might be helpful to clarify the difference between reflection or reflectivity and reflexivity, right? And I think especially in this idea of this will affect how we understand the absolute, right? And so one idea is an absolute, sort of an asymptotic absolute. So it's something that we just kind of get nearer and nearer and nearer and closer to the maximal reflectivity. Or we have an absolute in the sense of a pure self-relation, recursivity, you could say, this reflexive moment. And so when you cited this issue with Aristotle, thinking, right? Thought thinking itself, this sounds much closer to this recursive reflexivity, right? It's not a reflection, it's not a maximal reflection. And in this sense, yeah, I'm kind of, you've heard a lot of the metaphor of the mirror and the breaking through the mirror. But the issue now is that means we need a new sort of transformation. And the one that Nishitani offers himself is dancing, right? The mirror is a passive relation, right? It's receiving, right? But the issue here, he says, is the ability to take forms, right? Not receive, right? The ability to take form, and to take a form is to be a performer, to dance, right? To perform, right? And so we're no longer dealing with these issues of a passive reflection where we see each other as passively reflecting one another, but we are now performing, right? We are actors acting. And this then might help us get closer to what it means then to make a distinction between reflectivity and reflexivity.
Yeah, I think it really works, and also because it reminds me, of course, the distinction in Hegel between bad and good infinite. So you talked about asymptotic movement of reflection, which is what I called extrinsic reflection, because the reflection of the reflection of the reflection. You know, there is that passage by Ideen of Husserl that also Derrida quotes in Voice and Phenomenon, the Gallery of Dresda, where you can find a portrait which portraits another portrait, and so on and so on and so on. And this is kind of phenomenological movement. How does perception and sight works? Because there is something that always exceeds the possibilities of perception, which is the very act of perception itself. And so going back to reflection, we can say in this asymptotical reflexive movement, what can I not reflect? Precisely the movement of reflection itself. And that's why reflection is asymptotical. That's why I cannot grasp it as a whole. And this is the problem. But I think that the absolute reflection is a reflection that no longer has the problem to reflect also the movement of reflection itself, because it is absolutely one with it. And also because it doesn't work as how can I say, as an immediate and extrinsic reflection anymore. So the problem of reflecting, also the very form of reflection, shows itself when there is something exterior to the mirror, when this play of the dyad starts to work. But if all that is, if my soul is the pure mirror, and this means that my soul is, with Aristotle, all things, because it is all eide, I no longer have the problem to reflection, but because there is no reflection anymore in a certain sense, no extrinsic reflection anymore. So there is no more mediation to be mediated. The mediation becomes unmediated. And so that's why I think that this idea you had really, really works. And so I really thank you. And I don't know if my reply just fits what was the core of your question, but yeah, I think we can work on it. And I think, of course, this maybe problem of reflection is itself a kind of bad and asymptotical reflect, because we can talk and talk and talk and talk endlessly of this problem, which is really prominent in the whole history of philosophy, in my opinion, and also in Spinoza we can find something like that, when Spinoza says that in Beatitudo, I see God as God sees me. This is once again a form of reflection. So yeah, but thank you for your question.
I guess just very at the end, yeah, be careful identifying the I with the mirror, I guess. Again, a mirror is passive, it's dead. An I is not dead. We should learn that from Aristotle. But yeah, I'll leave the comment there.
Yeah.
Okay, we have still three questions, and then the next is Lorenzo, then Jim, and then finally I see that Professor Parks raises his hand. So the last three questions. The next is sorry. It's Lorenzo. Where is Lorenzo?
Somewhere.
Okay.
Hi, I'm trying to be short. So, first of all, I think that the three of you, in these 2 days, three of you, really spot on, started commenting that quote. So it really struck a chord. It's very interesting. But I feel by now some frustration. Not heard your presentation because it was excellent. But Nishitani is starting his discussion of Nietzsche with a discussion about speculation and mirroring. Whereas Nietzsche is one of the first authors, and I mean, he's one of the most interesting and first and quite aggressive critics of speculation, at least since the birth of tragedy. And so I'm surprised because, of course, he's opposing to this speculation, clarity, formality, egos. These are all things that already in birth of tragedy he was considering as Apollonian. And already in Birth of Tragedy, he was trying to create, to rediscover, to gather from the darkness, the Dionysian, which is of course dancing. It's in fusion and confusion, drunkenness, darkness, and especially music. So I've been focusing my research on olfaction in Nietzsche, but then of course, he's been very explicit. He has explicitly thought of himself as a musical figure. And he was stressing how original this thing was. So, and the fact that Nishitani is almost completely bypassing. He's using the drunken cup, and even then we've been taking this kind of watery thing as a reflection surface. But Zarathustra is not Dionysus, but of course, there are similarities. There's a kind of holographic overlap between these two figures. And we have mention of drunkenness in Zarathustra as well. So it's, for me, the fact that Nishitani is downplaying this theme of drunkenness that Dionysian in Zarathustra makes sense because he wants to make a comparison with Eckart. He would have a much harder I think he would have a much harder time to make this comparison without bypassing the Dionysian elements, which are probably curiously, because then the theme of self-sacrifice or overflowing is very Dionysian. There are, Christological tropes in the figure of Dionysus, but at the same time, they seem to be the most anti-Christian. So the things that are kind of opposing the most. But I would like to ask you, what about these anti-speculative tropes and ways of thinking in Nietzsche? Are we not just, focusing too much on this kind of on the continuity that Nishitani is highlighting, and forgetting how partial his reading of Nietzsche is in this specific case, especially when he begins a discussion of Nietzsche from an image of mirroring that I don't think is central in Nietzsche in general or in the Zarathustra. So like I want to, since it was like picked up a lot, but now I think I have some frustration about it, and I think we've been not very generous with Nietzsche if we skip the fact that he was trying to answer to this very question of speculation, of non-duality, of like stipulated by Heidegger in a completely different way, with dancing, with darkness, with confusion as well, as philosophical categories.
Yeah, wow, thank you so much for your question. That makes me think a lot. And I also have to confess when I read Nishitani's text, I also was surprised that it was full of also implicit referments to Hegel. The question of the dialectics and so on. And I also think that in a certain sense, speculation is something that it's more Apollonian. It's because the Apollonian element is in a certain sense it's the philosophical movement itself. But if we understand philosophy with Hegel as the speculative movement, as the movement of dialectics, because Apollos is the dialectic, it's the reasoning, it's the intellect, while Dionysus is something completely different. And so I also had this kind of impression, and at the end, I'm sorry I haven't thematized it, but yeah, I think that your question really it's really provoking and right. Maybe we should separate between two different modalities of reflection, two different mirrors, because also Dionysus uses a mirror, and while he watches himself in the mirror, he sees the whole world as reflected. And so the mirror of Dionysus immediately, I mean, maybe it's an anti-Hegelian mirror, because there is no mediation. So in this mirror, Dionysus immediately sees the manifold, immediately sees the world without mediation. And also the sparagmos that succeed this site is something that is really not dialectical, because the dialectics with Hegel always tries to fix what separates, to fix dialectically the many in one process. Why this symbolic and also ritual, in a certain sense, sparagmos of Dionysus, means that the one is immediately the many without mediation. So it is anti-Hegelian. There is no Apollo in this process, and so yeah, maybe my answer is, but in this sense, my understanding goes. Maybe it adjuncts something that we cannot find in Nishitani's reflections, but I think that the point is to distinguish between different forms and modalities of reflection, between different mirrors. Okay, but yeah, I totally agree with you that sometimes Nishitani's lectures are and understandings and readings of Western philosophy are I think very powerful, but also sometimes they have the tendency to reduce the core of the nucleus of the different philosophies that he reads, to one perspective that is the perspective that Nishitani needs to underline. Of course, this is a process that each philosopher encounters. Also, Aristotle used to modify the ancestors' philosophy and theories. But yeah, maybe it would be interesting to insist more on this anti-Hegelian kind of speculation. Would be a speculation without mediation. So yeah, but really thank you, Lorenzo, because it was really an insightful and important, I would say, remark. So yeah.
Thank you. So the next is a question from Jim.
Thank you very much for your comments, and I think what you said and what you said in response to the questions it confirms that a certain irony that the longer you pursue the image of the mirror and the search for absolute reflection, the more we show the limitations and the contradictions in using the model of the mirror. Let me be specific. You began by saying that nature has no mirrors, because mirror is immediacy, and in nature everything is immediate. But I think we could look at things the opposite way, that nature is all mirrors. In the Huayin image, everything in nature is like a little jewel. It reflects every other little jewel in nature. So it's not that there are no mirrors, but that everything is a mirror. Everything reflects each other. In the Avatamsaka Sutra, we have Indra's net. We have the hall of mirrors with the candle. We have the lion, the whole of the lion, his paws and his mouth and his eye. Everything is reflected in a single strand of the lion's coat. So in the world of nature, everything is recorded in everything else. Nature participates in everything around it. Our recording machines are very bad abstractions of what goes on all the time. Mirror is one way of recording. We have sound recorders as well, visual recorders. So if we think of everything in nature, then this idea of the mind as a mirror, or the nature as mirroring mind, are both distortions of the way the world actually functions. And I think this is what Nishida was trying to do when he said that the proper way of reflection was performative intuition. Unfortunately, this has been translated as active intuition or acting, as if it's opposed to passive. But actually, it's both active and passive, which was Zora's point, I think. It's performative. It's the exchange of eidos that goes on in the world of nature. Everything is reflected with everything else. And the reflection of mind is a selective reflection. It's partial, and it's bound in the end to be a distortion. That the idea of an absolute reflection, I think, is impossible. This is someone made a reference, I think, just made to Nietzsche, where he criticized what he called the doctrine of immaculate perception. This is what his way of saying that the Enlightenment had broken with the image of the Middle Ages, which was the mirror of mind, the consistency between our words and the way reality is, that model had broken down. So there's rather than see nature as unmediated, if we look upon nature as everything is mediated, then the mind's mediation, insofar as it's reflective like a mirror, is a distortion of the way nature works. And for mind to be returned to nature, to return to that performative intuition, is what I think the Buddhists would call enlightenment, but which probably only takes place in flashes. So.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Heisig, because of course your question also, how can I say, it inverted all the terms of my presentation, and I think that this is precisely a mirror feature because as you know, when we watch ourselves in a mirror, we see all the perspective inverted. And so I think that this dialogue between us, it's kind of a great example of mirroring in this sense. Okay, but apart from jokes, yeah, I think that your remark on Indra's net, it's really important in this sense because, yeah, of course, there is a form of mirroring, a form of speculation, which is also proper to nature, to the natural world. In also, I would say, a monadological sense. So also Nishitani, when he talks about Indra's net, he also uses Leibniz, the example of the monad, which has no windows, has no doors, because it doesn't need them, because it intensively contains, by reflecting it, all the universe. And there is that passage in monadology when Leibniz describes like a pot of water, and he says, oh, there is a fish inside, but if we look deeper, each atom of matter, of this matter, contains again other forms, and so on and so on and so on, in a sort of infinite reflection. Yeah, I think that the point, once again, is to distinguish between forms and modalities of reflection, because what I called reflection while I was saying that nature has not reflection, and reflection starts with culture and with the human performative gesture of tracing a sign. What I meant is that in this case we have that kind of reflection, which implies a form of redoublement, which implies the emerging of the double, like in Narcissus myth. So there is a kind of reflection, which is the reflection which is at the bottom and at the ground of culture and society and so on, which is, I think, this kind of reflection. So reflection that produces a double, that redouble things. I see myself as another. And this is precisely what they call like exterior and bad reflection, in a certain sense, and this is precisely that kind of reflection that must be overcome, and I think that that kind of reflection, of natural reflection that you mentioned, in a certain sense is the goal, is what we obtain when we overcome this can I say, this exterior reflection, which is the reflection that we can find in the cultural world. So in another word, we can say, okay, we have to gain another form of reflection. So from this kind of limited and redoubling reflection, we have to, as I said, to square it, to make it exponential, and making it exponential in a certain sense means precisely to return to a monistic, in a certain sense, kind of reflection, which is the reflection that is precisely the reflection that plays in the natural world, as you said. So I think there is maybe no contradiction between what you said and what I try to say. Of course, it just depends on what do we call reflection. And this is the problem, of course, because there are many forms, many ways to talk about reflection. But of course, this analysis and this answer goes beyond Nishitani's reflections, and so maybe I will definitely think about this whole discussions, and but really thank you, Professor Heisig. It was really good.
Just one short remark before to move to Professor Parks, but Jim, I think that the intranet is not a natural world, is the Dharma Dhatu. So is the natural world seen from the eye of the enlightened person. So it is what Lavinia says is the so-called reflection of reflection, when the mirror itself disappears and there is only mirroring without seer and without seeing. So it's in a certain sense is the goal, not a starting point. And so probably when Lavinia said so there could be a difference. So, and I wonder if, but the relation to Hegel is yes, of course, the Nishitani also in Nietzsche there is a deep relation to Hegel. Only I wonder if where is the role of the Aufhebung in this model, because I wonder if the reflection of Lavinia could be seen as Aufhebung, or is a dialectic without any Aufhebung. But anyway, Professor Parks, please. If you are still
can you hear me? All right, good. Hello, everyone. Wonderful to see you all, and sorry to come in so late. The reason is I'm
you. Moment. Where are you?
Oh, you don't see me?
Because I'm very bad with with computer. Yeah. Wait a moment, we switch. Where is Professor Parks? No, you are completely black. We see Professor O'Leary very well, but
yeah, I see him too. Hello, Joe. But I see me, but now I've frozen.
Frozen.
Yes.
Wait, I'll start again. Come in again. Oh, now I've gone. That's funny. And now you've gone silent. Everyone's got. Can anyone hear me?
No, we're just not speaking.
Okay. Well, you don't need to see me. Anyway, let me just say thank Emma for a very interesting presentation. I liked the very swift move from reflecting livers in the Timaeus to Heidegger's Spiegelspiel. And of course, Jim, you just made the point that I was going to make. Story of my life, Jim. I have a good idea, and I find Jim Heisig has already written about it. But yes, I think you're going a little too far when you say that nature means the absence of reflection and the absence of the double. I was thinking immediately of the beginning of Zarathustra, where he says to the sun, bless the cup that wants to overflow, that the water may carry everywhere the reflection of your delight. And so I think that there is a great deal of reflection going on in Nietzsche. I was thinking even more basically before Buddhism, in the Chinese tradition, you have Ganying, the idea of everything is sympathetically responding to itself. And, clouds over water take the form of fish and aquatic beasts, and clouds over desert plains take the form of fire, and so on. So I think I like what you said at the end, where you said, yeah, we need to get back to that kind of natural reflection. And I think, but it's maybe a little more complicated than you say. I'm going to work on trying to get visible again, because I was. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for your remarks. And just to clarify, but as I also tried to say, answering Professor Heisig's question, when I said that nature is, in a certain sense, the world of immediacy without reflection, I intended that natural world is kind of without that kind of reflection, which I call exterior and extrinsic reflection, which is precisely that reflection that occurs in the human context, and which is a reflection that implies a form of bad duality, a form of redoubling of the sight, which in a certain sense means a kind of form of pollution for the ego and for the self. And of course, in a certain sense, we can say that there is a powerful form of reflection also in nature, as we can say and we can argument with Leibniz or with Indra's net example, and also other great examples that you mentioned. I just think that we must distinguish between 4 different forms of reflection. And so when I said at the beginning that the natural world is a world without reflection, I meant precisely, and I'm sorry if it was unclear, that kind of reflection that we find, for instance, starting from Lascaux, okay, and that kind of reflection that constitutes, and this also is described in Nishitani's text as well, that kind of reflection that forms and constitutes the cultural world, and that forms what we call society. And so, of course, we can say that finally we have to go back to that kind of natural that kind of reflection that occurs in nature, in the universe as a cosmos. But I also agree with what Enrico said before, saying that of course that kind of reflection which occurs also in nature is that kind of all-encompassing reflection that is realized in the soul, which becomes in itself a mirror, which is the soul of the liberated self in this sense. And so, of course, I totally agree that the discourse is much more complicated than I try to argument in my presentation, but I think that the question is in itself complicated, and of course it deserves a lot of time to be discussed properly. And yeah, but thank you so much for your question, Professor Parks, and still looking forward to listen what you will tell us in your presentation.
Oh, yes, probably it's also time to get to know Professor Park. So thank you very much, Lavinia. And so also thank you to mention the role of art of Lascaux, that today in the morning, 14 years before, Felipe told us that there is no need for art or for learning, and I wanted to tell you soon at the time. But I had no opportunity to make this remark to Felipe, but you did it perfectly. So thank you very much.